Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we are thrilled to be sitting down with Julia Berg and Sarah Mason. They're both veteran Maryland public school educators and co-founders of something called Digging Deeper Educational Consulting. And it is really something that we want to bring to people, not only here in Maryland, but obviously around the country, to our listeners all around the United States, and talk about what they're doing with archaeology and indigenous communities and so many other facets of history, and bringing that to a different audience that we talk to normally, which is K-12 and beyond. So we'll dig into that here in a second. But just a reminder as we sort of kick off this episode, for people who are listening who are enjoying this, particularly if you enjoy this episode, give it a share so that, just jump onto whatever social media platform you're on, drop the link here, go to preservecast.org, grab the episode there. There's a whole bunch of different ways of sharing this. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn. There's all different ways of sharing this content, and sharing it is one of the best ways of getting it to a wider audience. Also, if you haven't rated it or reviewed it or given us those things, I know it seems silly, but if you're sitting there just listening, give us the 4 stars, the 5 stars, whatever platform you're on. We're, of course, on iTunes. We're on Spotify. We're on Amazon podcasts. Whichever way you do it, it does help. It kind of moves us up in the charts, and that's why it's valuable. And it's not just a chart thing. It's also something that's important because it gets us more eyeballs. So appreciate if you could do that as a PreserveCast listener. So like we do normally, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. And today we're fortunate that we have 2 guests, so we'll kind of play a little bit of air traffic control here with our guests, and maybe pitch it to Julia first. Where'd you grow up? And normally we're asking about why did you get into preservation, but why did you get into education? And then how did that lead you to this passion and interest for archaeology and for what you're doing today? So what's your story and your path to this version of preservation?
Thank you. Yeah. So my dad was a diplomat when I was growing up. And so I grew up sort of between various locations in Europe and the DC suburbs, bouncing back and forth every few years. And one of the things that always struck me was just how evident the history was in places like Europe. It's so much more visible, I think, than history is in the United States. In things like the landscape and the architecture, seeing things like, Viking ruins and medieval castles, just walking down the street or on a day-to-day basis. I think I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. I remember playing that with playing teacher with my stuffed animals as a kid and running the school. But it took me a little while to get there. I bounced around in some other jobs first, because I think I knew education was kind of where I wanted to be long term. And then ultimately ended up becoming a history teacher. I spent a lot of time in museums as a kid as well, and that also shaped my interest in cultural heritage.
And was it, before we jump over to Sarah, was it, a lot of people are interested in history. A lot of people are interested in teaching. A lot of people that we have on PreserveCast end up in academia just because of the nature where, we interview people who write books and things like that. And it takes a special person who wants to take history and convey it to like a K-12 audience. Like that is, and that's not to knock people who go into academia, but like, telling a college student about something or teaching graduate classes is one thing, but being able to convey that information to a different audience, to that younger audience, is challenging, right? Like there's Freeman Tilden, who is, I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but he was a Park Service person back in the 60s. And he was talking about interpretation. And he talks about how when you do interpretation for young adults, it's not just like a dumbed down version of
Sure.
interpretation, it's a altogether different thing. And I think that that's what sometimes people fail to recognize. So I'm curious, that decision that I love history, I love teaching, but I want to teach kids.
So it's funny that you say that, and I think it took me a while to realize this. Um, but I did have that love for history because it was so visible and so touchable. In Europe, it was around me. It was something that I could see, that I could touch, that I could interact with on a daily basis. I didn't feel that as much when I was, say, in high school in Northern Virginia. And so I distinctly remember loving my history classes when I was in Europe and kind of being bored with them when I was in the US. And then I went to college and I attended Gettysburg College, and my freshman year roommate was minoring in Civil War studies. And I remember sort of moaning and groaning and being like, I hated learning about Civil War history when I was in high school. Like, it's boring. It's just this battle and that battle, and and she said, no, 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 but you have to actually see it. And she said, let me take you on a battlefield tour. And so she took me one Saturday on, I'm not kidding you, it was like a 9-hour battlefield tour where we.
So she took you on the short version.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
we went around the entire Gettysburg battlefield with her just regaling me with these stories and pointing things out, little details that I, of course, never would have known without an experienced guide. And it made the history of those events so real. Again, and it was the first time that I really felt like I had when I was in Europe, and it felt like it was something that I could interact with, that I could touch, and that, I think, was what made it click for me and go, that's the kind of teacher I want to be. I want to be the kind of teacher that can bring the history to students in a way that makes them feel like they can be a part of it and touch it and interact with it, and that it feels alive to them. And so
I think
that
that's
felt
so
like my
fascinating.
challenge.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating because sometimes we'll hear, and I love kind of pulling these things out from these episodes where it's like, sometimes it's people have a really great teacher and they're like, I want to be like that. And it's almost like, not that you had bad teachers, but that you were like, I didn't have the experience I wanted here in the United States. I want to make it better for others. And I think that it's just a really wonderful kind of look at education and why you got into it. So Sarah, what's your story? What led you into this? I know you have sort of a different background, but I guess it kind of rhymes with Julia's. But what's your story in terms of where you grew up and why you got into this version of education?
So my grandmother lived about an hour away from the historic Triangle in Virginia. And so I spent a lot of summers going to Jamestown and Yorktown and Williamsburg, and it occupied my imagination. I distinctly remember being fascinated by the Powhatan and specifically Pocahontas. And I was about 8 years old when the movie came out through Disney. But I thought I was a scholar at 8 years old because I had read all of the books that were available in the children's section in Jamestown. And so I was fully prepared to go into this movie and enjoy it. And I was very angry. I was so angry at the movie because it was so inaccurate. And I remember just like throwing my book on the ground. And I was like, this is not okay. So it was very early love for the stories of people in the past. I wanted to understand how people lived differently. I wanted to understand where Indigenous people went, because I was raised with the idea that Indigenous people were gone, and that the heritage and the knowledge has all disappeared. And I wanted to understand why. That curiosity never went away. It was there all throughout high school, and I knew I wanted to do something with history. It had always been my favorite subject, and I wanted to go into archaeology, but I had this belief that I just did not have the math skills for it. That archaeology was for the smart people, and I just wasn't one of them. And so I went for a safe route, or what I identified was a safe route, which was education. That does not mean that I have not put my entire heart and soul into education, which I absolutely have. I've always known that I wanted to be a public servant. I want to give back to the community. I can't sit behind a desk and make numbers and make money for someone else. That's not my purpose. My purpose is now I know that my purpose is to bear witness to the stories of the people that have been silenced in the past and to be an echoing point for that. I want to make space for that. And I want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to hear all of the stories that make Maryland and our nation great. So as a teacher, I have the opportunity to serve our local youth and to help them connect the past with the present.
Well, just to be clear, since I've heard you present and have had the opportunity to engage with you a few times, you are one of the smart ones. So we just need to clear that up for young Sarah. We're talking to young Sarah right now. And I was sort of joking that that it rhymed, and I didn't really know that piece, but you literally both had Bergs in your story. You had Julia has Gettysburg, and then you have Williamsburg. So so it quite literally. Yeah, they don't just rhyme, but you got the Bergs in, and then you're Julia Berg. So I mean, it's Berg on Berg on Berg. So so you both end up teaching. How does this come about? Like, we're going to talk about the work that you do that, I sort of teased up front, like this is something everybody needs to hear, but this is something that I think a lot of groups are struggling with understanding. And when I say groups, I mean preservation organizations, planning, agencies, museums, heritage areas, whether they be state or national, are all trying to wrap their arms around how they do a better job of this, because we know that we only create long-term preservation ethic when we capture the minds of kids, right? And I don't mean capture in like a bad way. That's not like a sort of bad look at that. It's how do you get kids excited about this and make them lifelong learners, but also lifelong stewards of history? So obviously, I want to get into that and talk about that and explore how this, might be of interest to a national audience. But I'm also curious how the nuts and bolts of how this came together. So are you guys like teaching in the same school, bump into each other in the lunchroom and are like, do you like archaeology? Yes. Do you like art? Like, how does this actually? So maybe we'll kick it over to Julius and Sarah, answer the last one. Like, what's the origin story here?
So I actually started teaching in Baltimore City. I started as I started as an English teacher in Baltimore City, and then was looking to move, and ended up getting hired as a social studies teacher in Wycomico County. The school that I got hired at, Sarah was already working as a history teacher there. And, me being the new kid in town, Sarah and a couple of the other people in the social studies department, invited me to have lunch with them, so I'm like, look at me, I'm making friends. Right. And so, and that was really it. I mean, I sort of became part of that department. And we're still, friends with that core history department that was there, when I moved to our school. We're still good friends, and we have the friendship has just blossomed since then. We recognize that we have similar interests and similar values and similar goals, and things have just taken off from there. We actually, it was the parent of a student that turned us on to the Archaeological Society of Maryland in 2019. We'd been sort of itching to get more into the primary sources that inform the history. We're in the classroom teaching the textbooks and the history as it's written, but we wanted to kind of get to how those textbooks are written, and how the stories are told. And so we wanted to go directly to the source, and we showed up to a public dig in 2019, and we've never left. We just became the teachers, and I'm pretty sure they couldn't tell us apart for like a year. And we were just these two teachers that kept showing up to archaeology events, and the rest is history.
Yeah. So, Sarah, I mean, a lot of people have great, friendships in their respective departments. Not everyone then takes that to the next level of we're going to go to an archaeological excavation, but maybe some do. But then very few, if any, that I've ever met. And that's why when I heard your presentation, I was like, oh, I got to get them on here, because I think this is an important story. And not only an important story, but I think a cool program. But like, how did you what was the thought process of we need to turn this into something that advises? And so what we're talking about now is sort of the creation of Digging Deeper LLC and the work that does. And then when we can kind of dig into that, but what's the origin of that then next step?
So as Julia mentioned, we kind of just kept showing up over and over again, and we kept saying yes to opportunities to work with and provide like the labor for the Maryland Historical Trust through the Archaeological Society of Maryland. If they were interested in a project, they would reach out to us. If we had an idea, they heard us out. And it was a level of respect that teachers struggle to receive. The teaching community creates really solid colleagues because the environment is difficult and the hearts are really big. And so you make these lifelong friendships. And Julie and I, we joke that we're the same person, and we often accidentally end up like wearing the same outfits. That is very common for us. We share a brain. And so we just kept showing up, and the archaeology community kept saying yes, and we kept saying yes. We went to a conference together at one point in time, and we heard the archaeologists' desire. They kept saying they wanted to get their research into the hands of K-12, but they're having a harder and harder time. And they didn't quite understand why they couldn't just show up at a school and just talk at kids. Why was this approach not working? And Julia and I are like swirling around in the background going, I know exactly why, because we have that insider perspective. A lot of adults see education through the eyes of their childhood, and that is a limited perspective. So we have the view through the eyes of career professionals as adults, and education has drastically changed in the last 30 years. My memories are not the same memories. Well, my memories do not reflect my practice. Let's put it that way. So we saw this need, we heard this need, and we said, we can facilitate this. We understand enough about the archaeological practices that we can collaborate with other archaeologists and translate that understanding to teachers. And we decided to develop Digging Deeper as very much a nudge from our friends at the Maryland Historical Trust. They wanted us to invite more teachers into their community. And so we were kind of encouraged to write a grant, and they gently and kindly pushed us towards Dr. Kat Sterner of Towson University, who has established the Baltimore Community Archaeology Lab. And they said, you should write a grant with her, and you should host this teacher workshop that you have been dreaming about. We hear you. We believe you that this is the solution to our problems. You should do this. And so we did. We wrote the grant, and we were generously funded by the Maryland Historical Trust non-capital grant. And we held our first pilot workshop, which is called From Trials to Teaching, last summer. And we invited teachers from Maryland, from all across Maryland, to come out to a dig at North Point State Park. And we taught them how archaeology is done, the ethics behind it, the practices behind it, the voices behind it, especially, and its community implications. And Kat she helped us fully understand all of the elements of archaeology and the practices that we might not necessarily see as the physical labor for ASM. And we worked with her to teach the teachers how to build it into their curriculums. And so the important part about digging deeper is we don't write the curriculum. That's not what we see our job as. We don't tell the teachers what to do. That they don't need one more thing on their list. They need inspiration. They need drive. They need their spark. And so we invite them into spaces to learn new things. And then they find the connections in their curriculum, in their classrooms, in their communities, in their kids. And they then bring the information to their students in the way that they see fit.
So there's a lot to unpack there. You just gave us a lot. No, I mean, it's great. I mean, I feel like there's a couple things that I just kind of want to point out that I feel like are really helpful. One, about this idea of like respect for teachers. Like, I think that a lot of times, and sort of along this lines of what you mentioned, where it's like, well, we'll write the curriculum, we know better, and then they can use it. Like, that's not really the kind of way that it works. And that teachers need sparks, which is interesting because I think a lot of times organizations, that mine own included, that don't do as much K-12 as perhaps they even want to, are intimidated by it, because it's like, well, I can't run a whole education program, and I can't, and it feels like you're being asked to boil the ocean. And instead, sometimes it's just creating that spark, which is interesting because in a different part of preservation, we talk about this a lot with like the trades and apprenticeships and the hands-on work, that every preservation group can be a group that cares and engages in historic trades training, because part of it could be just meeting a tradesperson, hosting an event where people get to see it being done. And that spark is a part of the trades ecosystem. And so that spark is also a part of the ecosystem of engaging with K-12. So I think that that's interesting. I think the other thing too here that has broader implications for the way that preservationists think about our work is something that you said that I've never really heard said before, is that you need to sort of like change, like education has changed from what we remember during our, and it's sort of like we need to be thinking about that always about our work. Like, has the field moved on in the way that we're thinking about it, still captured by maybe the way we learned about it in college or the way we learned about it in K-12? And I think that also, and want to talk about sort of the experience next, but there was just so much in there that you said that I really wanted to point out. But like, I think it's also really interesting, this idea that, like how this change from what we remember, but also there's, I think the best educators, oftentimes my experience, and I don't know what you think about this, maybe you can, maybe Julia or Sarah can respond to this, but are those who remember what it was like to be a kid and to be presented with that information. And for people who don't remember that as well, or aren't accustomed to thinking about it through the eyes of K-12, it's important, back to that respect comment for teachers, to listen to teachers about what it's like in the classroom now, what it's like to be a kid, what interests them, what engages them, because I'm sure different things engage them now than did 30 years ago. So anyway, there's a lot in there. Maybe people can rewind back and listen to Sarah's comment there, because I think there's a lot to unpack. But let's maybe pitch over to Julia, or, if anybody wants to respond to anything I said, of course. But like, Julia, Sarah, talk to us about what this experience looks like. So if somebody were to bring Digging Deeper in, or they were trying to contemplate something like this, to do something like this, what is the experience that you curate for these educators that is different than just like come out to our field day and see archaeologists trowel?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So really what we see ourselves is we are the bridge between the archaeologists and the folks in historic preservation and the educators, because we kind of have a foot in both worlds, right? We've been in the archaeological space, participating in archaeology digs and going through the certified archaeological technician program for years now. And we have, this experience as classroom teachers. We are that bridge that can kind of speak both languages. We can translate between the two fields. And so what we do is create these immersive workshops for teachers to bring them into an archaeological or historic space to learn about the history, to learn about the archaeological practices, to learn about the descendant communities of this particular location, all the while giving teachers what we call lesson seeds, which are not the full lesson, but the seed of a lesson. So something that a lesson can grow from, an idea for a lesson. So here's a piece that you might want to bring into your classroom and build upon or grow as you bring it in front of your students. Here's a little nugget of something that you might want to turn into something bigger and better later on. And so we flip back and forth between the experience of being in the field of archaeology or in the field of history or speaking with experts who are either from the descendant community or from the archaeology community, and then taking a step back and moving into, okay, how does this apply to the classroom? How would you bring this into the classroom? What could this look like in the classroom? And not just a sort of secondary history classroom. I mean, that's our world, as secondary history educators. But someone who is an elementary school math teacher, or someone who is a high school English teacher, or someone who is a science teacher, right? There are so many different ways. Archaeology is beautiful in that it somehow applies to every discipline, which is incredible. And so being able to spark that little inspiration in teachers, no matter what age group they teach, no matter what their subject area is. And so we create those experiences and those opportunities for teachers to engage with the history and archaeology, and then the space for them to create something that they know is going to work in their classroom, rather than having something pushed onto their plate and be given one more thing that they have to do, because teachers have a lot on their plates. It's more of giving teachers an array of things that they can choose from and then pull into their classrooms as they see fit. Because really, we're leaning on the expertise and we're honoring the expertise of teachers. They know their content, they know their curriculum better than anybody else. And as well-intentioned as archaeologists are, and I know that they mean well, they want to create resources for teachers to use, it isn't landing because there is that disconnect. The teachers are the experts. The teachers are the ones that should be creating the resources, but they need to be welcomed into the spaces and given the knowledge and the inspiration to do so.
It's interesting. Yeah. Well, I just want, and then maybe we'll kick it over to Sarah, but it's interesting that, like a lot of good ideas, it's kind of the simplicity is the elegance of it, right? Where it's like, it's not overwrought. It's not, because I think that that's where a lot of organizations and museums and, people who run nonprofits like myself kind of like fall down, where we're, maybe it's almost like we're overthinking it sometimes, like creating a space, respecting their understanding of their own field, and then seeing where that leads. I think that that's an interesting thing. Sarah, I was going to ask, it's sort of a two-parter. Why do you think this hasn't been done before? And then sort of as another side to that, which is a little disjointed question here, but then what is the actual logistical experience like? Like, how long are they out there? So sort of the bigger picture, why has it taken this long? And then what kind of an experience does a teacher actually physically get when they come to one of these, or have in the past when you've done these?
I like your first question about why hasn't this been done before? And I don't know, because to me, it seems like an obvious solution. Our intention is to empower educators. And maybe the answer lies in the fact that we're not a respected career. We were just declassified as professional this past week. So we are not a well-respected career field for various reasons that we don't have time to unpack right now. And so that might be the baseline of it. Additionally, specifically archaeology, we would like to identify that both of these professions are misunderstood. When people think archaeology, they think Indiana Jones, and they think just stealing artifacts. When they think teachers, they think that we just sit on the floor and we play with kids and we color all day long. There's this misunderstanding and this public lack of awareness around what the professions actually include. And so, as Julia mentioned, as serving as the bridge, and I heard someone the other day call us matchmakers too. I thought that was pretty cute. By connecting these two professions together, we're saying, hi, you don't know a whole lot about what we do, and these people over here don't know a whole lot about what you do. But if we collaborate, the values and the skills and the knowledge that we have will actually enhance each other's work. So let's do this together. Julia and I, we're definitely a rare commodity in the archaeology world. There's not a whole lot of teachers that just go out to digs on a weekend and want to learn and play in the dirt. But the more we engage with the preservation community, the more there seems to be an interest in our skills of serving as that matchmaker or serving as that bridge between the cultural heritage communities and the education communities. Because like Julia mentioned, the teachers are the experts, and we are restricted by state standards as to what we can and cannot teach. However, we have a lot of wiggle room, and since archaeology specifically is so open-ended, I like to call it the STEAM, right? It's STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math, but it has that H in there too, or it has the humanities, and it even has the art in there. So it's everything. So you can find a connection, but you have to give that opportunity to the teacher. You have to invite them into the space and empower them with knowledge, and then they will make the magic happen. You got to give them the space, you got to give them the knowledge, and then they will bring it to the kids. If you want to change culture, you have to get to the kids. If you want to get to the kids, you've got to get to the teachers. And so I hope that answered your first question. I can pivot to the
absolutely.
Second
No, I think that's super helpful. And I think it's important. We've had a lot of conversations on PreserveCast over the years about like the changing relevance of cultural resource management and just the broader preservation community and how we maintain relevance and how we engage different communities and future generations in making sure that this work continues. And you have to reach across disciplines, I think, in order to do that. That's one thing that people have kind of like broadly said, sort of just like big picture, we need to reach across disciplines. And this is like a real world example of that. Like I could imagine this being called out in one of those treatises that talks about the relevance of preservation and how we do this in the future as like, okay, well, here's an example of how you do it. Because it's one thing to throw that out, but then I think a lot of groups are sitting there kind of scratching their heads like, well, we want to do this well, but we just don't know. And this is obviously an example. And, Digging Deeper has been doing a lot of this work. So then what is the experience like? So someone's just listening and they're like, okay, but then... So how long are they out there? Do you have to feed them? Like, is it, what's the cost? Like, because those details people do get, not I don't want to say bogged down, but those can be a challenge sometimes.
Absolutely. The logistics are challenging, but honestly, that's part of what Julia and I love the most. That's what classroom teaching is. It's managing logistics all day long for 30 different kids, 30 different needs all day. And so it's kind of where we shine, honestly. And so what we've done is we've created a workshop. The incentive for teachers is that they get 3 continuing professional development credits. So in Maryland, in order to maintain your license, every 5 years, you have to have 6 continuing professional development credits, and they are allocated by hours. And so for every 15 hours, you get 1 credit. So essentially, we've created a 5-day workshop. And teachers get the vast majority of those credits in those 5 days, and then they have an additional 5 hours that they can continue to build their lesson and then submit it. And that awards them those 3 continuing professional developments. We call that like the carrot. That's the reason that the teachers, one of the reasons that they're biting. The other reason is that because what we're offering is super cool. We're not just shoving them in a classroom. We are offering them a really fun, unique hands-on experience where they have the opportunity to engage in an actual archaeology and learning. So we provide them with a classroom space in addition to the field workspace. And so we spend some time, we split our day kind of in half, and we do some archaeology, and then we do some lesson planning as well. And we took all of the 5 days and we divided them up in the way that we wanted to learn archaeology. We actually sat down and said, if we could learn this all over again from day one, how would we want to learn it? And so we divided the days up through like ethics and descendant communities and safety practices and lab experiences and career opportunities. We divided that up and the topics up, and we incorporated and invited speakers in as well that could reflect and speak knowledgeably on all of those topics. We did feed them as well. We were able to provide them with a stipend. Again, we were generously funded by the Maryland Historical Trust, and we were able to provide them with a per diem essentially. And we also, because we were digging in at North Point State Park and we invited teachers from all around Maryland, we made sure that we had a hotel for them as well so that they could easily be transported back and forth. Towson University was able to provide vans, and we were able to move them back and forth between the park and the hotel pretty easily. And so providing teachers not only with CPD credits, but also lodging and per diem really helped make this a very easy decision for them. Treat them like rock stars when you can, because they are exhausted for 190 days a year. So we took the opportunity to treat them really, really well.
Yeah, and that comes back to the respect piece, and I think that that's just being kind and leading with kindness and respect. Never really seems to have any downside. I think that's important. So obviously we want to talk about kind of like, I don't want to say this is a proof of concept, but like this was to show that it really worked, and it did. What's the future of this, and how does that lead into Passages and Pathways, which I know is a publication. So I feel like that's kind of part of the evolution now, but where's the future of this? How are you hoping to grow it, and where does that tie in?
So, like Sarah was saying, when we treat teachers really well, word of mouth tends to be one of the main ways that teachers sign up for professional development opportunities. So when teachers are looking for the classes that they're going to need, the workshops that they're going to need to renew their teaching licenses, they hear from other teachers like, hey, I went to this amazing workshop, and they put us up in a hotel, and they fed us, and I got to play in the dirt, and it was really great, and I learned a bunch, and it was really fun. That word of mouth goes a really long way in terms of getting additional teachers to sign up and sustaining the workshop year over year. And so that's another reason why, not just because we believe that teachers should be respected and treated well, but also because that word of mouth really goes a long way. Teachers talk up workshops that were life-changing for them. And so with regard to the Passages and Pathways, so Maryland just recently adopted new state standards for grade 6 and 7, or a new framework for grade 6 and 7 social studies. And it's a big change in how social studies is taught. Most of us, when we were in school, we learned history chronologically, right? And you started at one time period and you just move forward throughout history. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And we're just working our way down the timeline. And the standards that Maryland just adopted are, instead of being historically or chronologically focused, they're geographically focused. So they are more thematic than they are chronological. And that is a really big brain shift for teaching and for learning. It's a very different way of teaching and learning history. We were approached by a publishing company, Gibbs Smith, and they wanted teachers, and to their credit, the fact that they wanted to include educators' voices in the creation of this content speaks to what a great company they are. And they asked us if we would be willing to serve as content writers for this new set of textbooks that they intended to publish that would reflect and follow those new standards. Because that's part of the challenge, right? If you create an entirely new history course, right, there's no textbook that's going to reflect that. And so the textbook company decided, you know what, we're gonna create a textbook that actually reflects these standards in this way. And so Sarah and I served as writers. This was actually before we were digging deeper. We served as writers for those textbooks, and together we wrote about 50% of the content in these two textbooks. So there's one for 6th grade, one for 7th grade, and they're a sister set. It's intended to be a sort of 2-year human geography course. Those textbooks are out now. They've been published. And they are available anywhere in Maryland. Districts that are adopting textbooks is a district level decision, right? So school districts who are interested in adopting these textbooks can reach out to Gibbs Smith or to us, and we'll put you in contact with one of their reps. And request books for a pilot program, or to go through a textbook adoption committee, or whatever procedures the district has, if they're interested in looking into that. And I we're think really that's proud of the work we've done with them.
I bet, and you should, and I feel like that's an interesting thing too for the preservation and museum community to be thinking about, is just like, how does their respective state treat the teaching of history? Like, even if it's not a part of your day-to-day work, just understanding that, because like, I'm ashamed to say that I didn't really know that we were moving to a geographic sort of exploration of history. Not that that's challenging for a preservation group or an archaeology group to adapt to, because a lot of us already think about our work like that. Like, we think about architectural styles that are endemic to certain regions of the state. You don't see certain barn styles that, you see in the Cumberland Valley of Maryland that you would see, on the Eastern Shore. And that's the same for, any place in the country. So our work sort of lends itself to that, but not knowing it, is a challenge, and one way to know it is to be better engaged with educators, which is what this whole conversation's been about. Before we kind of draw to a little bit of a conclusion here, at least on this first conversation, and maybe we'll have you back to talk more in the future as this unfolds. But Sarah, I'm curious, part of one of the ways that we met is we heard, I got a chance to hear you. We're also, you mentioned the Baltimore Community Archaeology Lab in Preservation Maryland, which is the organization that powers PreserveCast, is also a partner in BCAL, because we think it's a really interesting way of exploring archaeology and engaging the public in that conversation. And the way that we heard you was at a conference that was looking at the intersection of the indigenous community and archaeologists. There's obviously a lot wrapped up in archaeology, particularly when it comes to, you're talking about respect between the archaeology community and the history that they're uncovering, which is the history in many cases of different indigenous peoples who inhabited Maryland for some 13,000 years prior to European arrival. But there's a host of other groups that are wrapped up. Basically, anybody who's ever set foot on Maryland is going to be somehow represented in the archaeological record. How do you handle that piece of this? I mean, I know that's like a huge question. That could be a whole separate, probably PreserveCast, but I'm sure people listening are just kind of curious about, we've had, the conversation has focused a lot on respect. And I think that that's a great way of kind of looking at the work. How do you respect those issues and those voices in the archaeological story and that conversation?
I love this question, and it's heavy, but I enjoy thinking about difficult things and heavy concepts, especially when it has to do with the rights of groups and individuals and justice, quite honestly. So this is a loaded conversation, and I don't want to, I guess I can put on my archaeology hat, even though I'm not a professional archaeologist. So what I can say is that I've leaned into listening to the conversation, because I first will always tell you that I don't know what I don't know. And when it comes to Indigenous history across the United States and even in Maryland, there are many gaps that I am actively trying to build my awareness of. And so when it came to building, for instance, from trials to teaching, we wanted to make sure that we had Indigenous voices and representation because the site that we were at was prehistoric. And so step number one in archaeology is to connect with your descendant community and ensure that they are part of the permissions and the interpretation of the site. And so that land belongs to the Piscataway Conoy. And so they were involved in they were involved in the workshop. They were invited every day to be there, and they were provided with an entire workshop session where their perspectives on archaeology were heard. And we wanted the teachers to listen to the difficult history, and Kat did an amazing job laying out the harms of archaeology of the past and what it has done to the Indigenous community, how it has been weaponized against them. And then, with that being said, also turned around, did an about face around the 80s, I guess, 80s and 90s, trying to turn things around to now be the ally, to now be part of the good guy team. And it's a complicated relationship. And the Indigenous community has every reason to be distrustful. We want to validate that. There's 400 years of oppression and silence and silencing. And we are honored that there are representatives from the Piscataway Conoy tribe and from the Pocomoke specifically that trust myself and Julia and Digging Deeper and BCal and Kat Sterner, that trust us enough that they will invite us into their spaces. And that they will share their voices and share their stories with people that we bring into their land. So presenting at the Trials to Teaching workshop and sharing their story and their evolving relationship with archaeology, like I'm thinking of Rico Newman specifically and Francis Gray, they're representatives of the Piscataway, and hearing their voices and how their relationships with archaeology has changed over time. And most recently, as another effort to make those relationships right, Kat from BCal, as well as us, Charles County Public Schools, and the Piscataway Conoy have all collaborated and wrote a grant for and were awarded the grant to create a Maryland Indigenous Archaeology Summer Program in Charles County. So that is going to take place for 3 summers starting this coming summer, where youth in Charles County that identify as Piscataway and having Piscataway heritage, they are going to be invited to participate in this camp where they get to learn about their heritage, their cultural heritage, as well as archaeology and how those two worlds can work together to heal the wrongs, maybe not heal the wrongs of the past, but validate them and move forward to make a more equitable future. So one step at a time.
Yeah, no, and I think that, I mean, obviously, I think just the fact that you were able to, address the question and kind of in great detail shows that it's a lot about representation and respect, right? Like kind of coming back to these core tenets of what you guys are working on, and this idea of making sure people are in the room. And I also just think allowing teachers to hear the conversation, right? It's not about trying to tell them exactly how they should teach it or what they should take away. It's about exposing them to the conversation, letting them know that that's happening. Because like you said, there's a lot of misconceptions about archaeology. And if you're of the Indiana Jones model, you're not really thinking about descendant communities and respect for the past. And that might not be because you're a bad person or something like that. It's just you just haven't even really ever even thought about it. It's just not really a part of it. And so now by exposing them to that conversation, allowing them to hear different perspectives and viewpoints, that can be part of, even if it's just a slender little part of what they might present to a student. Now a student is thinking, oh, yeah, this is somebody else's history. That's interesting. I wonder who descended from that person. And I think that's a fascinating thing. And there still is just a glimmer of that Indiana Jones piece in there, in that there's mysteries, to be uncovered. There are interesting things underfoot, and I think that kind of sparks the curiosity in a young mind, or any mind for that matter. People are fascinated by archaeology because this idea that there are things out there we still don't know, and that is fascinating. So we could keep going, but we got to put a cap on this at some point. The 250th anniversary of the country is coming up in 2026. What are you hoping? I guess we've been asking people this question about what they hope for the preservation community, but perhaps what do you hope as educators that your students might get out of that upcoming commemoration? Where are you? What is your optimistic take on what might come of that moment? Maybe start with Julia and then ask you both this question.
Well, I mean, I'm sure this isn't going to come as any surprise given the conversations that we've been having, but really just making sure that the full story of this country is told. And that as we are celebrating the sort of red, white, and blue patriotic founding of the 250th founding of the country, that we're not losing sight of the stories of everyone who has existed on this land, whether it was before Europeans arrived here, or whether it was people who were brought here against their will, whether, these voices that were silenced for a really long time, and whose stories were not told, not brought to light, ignored, left out of history books, that we do have the means, especially through archaeology, to help reconstruct some of those stories. If we listen to the descendant communities, if we listen to the artifacts, we have the opportunity to bring more voices into the narrative than has traditionally been done in the past. And so I would hope that that on this 250th anniversary, that we would try to tell a more complete story of America's past.
Sarah, where are you at on that?
So I teach 8th grade U.S. history, and I spend a lot of time teaching my students about the founding documents and how they have been interpreted through time, and what, in addition to what Julia said, we certainly both stand on that value that our nation was founded in equitable ways, but with immense diversity. And while we have heavily focused on telling the stories of people with one certain background, we need to have a more diverse conversation about our history. With that being said, I also want to empower our youth to remember that our founding documents, specifically our Constitution, I know that's not the focus necessarily of 250, but it's more the Declaration. But nonetheless, the Constitution is meant to be flexible. That's why it is as old as it is. And so it is our responsibility, and it was handed to us in those documents, that we as the people, that it was framed for us. Even if the people that our framers had in mind were of one demographic, it is now our document. It is our Constitution. And so we have the rights and the responsibility to hold our government accountable, and to put limitations on it. That was the intention of it. We need to move forward recognizing that the power still belongs to us, and we need to utilize it in order to create that more equitable future that our framers were demanding.
Yeah, and I think those are two great answers from educators. I think it's interesting just to hear, your thought on this, because we've been thinking about the 250th. I know a lot of people are thinking about the 250th from the perspective of preservation organizations and museums, but this will play out in classrooms across the country, and these conversations around who the Constitution is meant for, and how the Declaration, who it spoke to, and obviously Ken Burns is having a moment and a conversation about that right now as well. And I don't know if any of your students have slogged through all 12 hours of that, but I'm seeing head shaking. No, but we're approaching a moment where history and this conversation will be front and center, and an opportunity for everyone to engage. And to be that spark, which has sort of been a recurring theme throughout this whole conversation about this idea that we don't have to answer all the questions, but we can pose questions and let people kind of think about them. Before we go, we ask everybody their favorite historic place or site. So we'll go back and forth here. We'll go Julia and then Sarah.
So I was really moved. We actually took a trip together out to Mesa Verde a few years ago. And Mesa Verde was a really impactful location. We hadn't spent a lot of time out in the Southwest, and it was just a very different environment and landscape than we're used to here. And somewhere where you could really feel the history and the people and in that location. So Mesa Verde.
I have a hard time nailing down just one because Williamsburg is the one that captivates my childhood heart. So Mesa Verde is the one that captivates my understanding that Indigenous people are still here and we need to listen to the wisdom that they bring to the table. And but another one as well is a really obscure one, but it holds a very special place in my heart. And that's the Jacob Tome School of all places. That's up in Cecil County. It's a giant abandoned school complex. And I fell in love with historic architecture up there. You should Google it. It's pretty much gone now. It was registered as a national historic place, but it is pretty much gone now. But it lit a fire in my probably early college years, and that's when I realized that I had my future was absolutely in history, because the buildings told stories and I could hear them. I could hear them when I walked around the campus, and I wanted to learn more.
Well, that's a perfect place to end the conversation because, PreserveCast and our listeners, many of us are all sort of dedicated to this work and make this proposition that by doing this, we'll inspire future generations. And you just suggested that, even in its derelict form, a historic structure inspired you along this way. And that's a powerful statement. And I think a great way to cap a conversation that I think is important for people to hear, to think about, and to think about ways of engaging with digging deeper in both of you on this as this work expands and you move into summer camps and you think about engaging more teachers and writing textbooks. I think we'll be hearing more from you in the coming years. If people want to get engaged, we'll put a link in the show notes, of course, and so they'll see that in here. They don't have to wait till the end of the conversation to get this plug. But how do they reach out? How do they get engaged? And we'll make sure that we just have links too, so they'll see them as they are clicking on this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. We are on LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook, and we have a website, diggingdeepered.org. And certainly our email addresses are out there. We can make them available to you. People can feel free to reach out to us, contact us. We also try to make it to regional, local, national archaeology conferences when possible. So people can catch up with us there.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us and spending your time with us. We really appreciate it and look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland and is powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2017, the podcast has told stories from around the world about how people are documenting, caring for, and interpreting the past. If you want to support this effort, please visit preservecast.org to learn more and keep on preserving.